My first guest this week is David Marcus. He is a writer whose work has been featured in The Federalist, The New York Post, and other publications. And he is the author of a new book titled Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed a Nation. Now, there have been a few books written about COVID already, and there'll be many more, I'm sure, in the months and years to come. But as of now, many of the books are written from the perspective of an outsider. So it's kind of like dates and timelines and science and graphs, and this is what happened and where the virus originated and who said what and when, and, very methodical and detailed, which is a good thing. But what David does is a little different. David writes his book from the perspective of an insider. So he's writing it, same thing as a timeline. Many of the other things are in the book, but he writes it kind of as a first person account. So where was he when things started to change, how it affected him and his family and decisions they had to make. And it gives the story a more richness, draws the reader in and makes you think, where was I at that time? Was I thinking the same thing? What did I do when that happened? And it really makes it interesting and gives you a better understanding of what happened. And he also talks about these myths, things we believe that we know now weren't completely true or were just flat out lies. Here is the first segment of our interview. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
So your book, Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed the Nation, a lot of people are going to and have written books and articles and long form writing about it. So what made you want to write a book about it?
So I started the book about this time last year, at a point in time where I was covering the pandemic, both for the Federalist and the New York Post. So I was already writing about it pretty much every day. And by June, really, especially after the protests, the George Floyd protests and stuff started, and some of the real hypocrisy started coming out, it became clear to me two things. One, that the American people weren't getting the full story, and that in a lot of cases they were being lied to. And two, that those lies were getting memory hold, and a false history was being written of this whole event, dating all the way back to January. So my purpose in writing the book was just to try to express the truth of the situation as best I could. And ultimately, because the subject matter is so big, right? Like, this affected everybody's life. So, I mean, you could write 1,000 books on what happened over the last year. I tried to focus in on what I thought were the two most important institutions involved. The first is obviously the government, because the government is the one that puts all the orders in place. But the second was the media. And the media was really important because, as I point out in the book, this wasn't so much enforced as it was consented to. Mm-hmm. And the media played a major role in convincing everybody to just go along with it. So that's sort of the cultural angle that I try to take in my book, which is a little different than debates over science and right. Things like that.
Okay, let's start there then. The name of the book is Charade. So tell everybody what the charade was.
Well, a charade is really, a charade, it's funny. It's a newcomer to the English language. It arrived from French in about the 18th century. And it has it's a trick. It's something that's false. But more than that, it has a very sort of like pretty presentation, and it is typically somewhat all-consuming. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of worked in my own mind for what was happening with regard to the pandemic, because for so long, for months and months, you weren't allowed to talk about, for example, the downsides of the lockdown, right? If you even raised the question of, oh, wait a minute, when can my kid go back to school? Or wait, are teenagers getting really depressed? If you even tried to raise these questions, you were killing grandma. And so the charade was this sort of like just pretending that like there was nothing but upside in shutting down our entire economy and keeping everybody locked up in their houses, because we weren't allowed to talk about the downsides, which really should have been obvious.
Well, one interesting thing you talk about, because you write about that in work, kind of the things that you talk about in the book. You talk about, well, what is a charade? One piece I like to add that, which makes, I think, a good title for your book, is that in what the charade is, it's also something everybody goes along with, right? It's like an act. It's like we know it's not really true because at some point, at the beginning, I'll admit there's a lot of things, there were a lot of unknowns. But even when we got to the point, and we'll go through this as we talk about the book, but just on the charade title, we got to the point that people knew what they weren't saying was true, but it's like you say, it's an act, it's a charade. We're all just supposed to, there's a thing I'm supposed to say, and there's a reaction you're supposed to have, and let's just do it, right? And action.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I think that one of the prime examples of that is the way that Democrats in general, but specifically Joe Biden, sort of performed the mask. Even a month ago, right? He was on that Zoom call with world leaders, and he was the only one wearing a mask. Like, what are you doing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, obviously, this has nothing to do with science or the disease or any of that. It's all a form of virtue signaling. It's all sort of a symbol of like, oh, this is what right-minded good people do. Right. And ultimately, that's a form of control.
Right. Now, we're going to get into the book, and some, for those of you who try to understand how these conversations go, sometimes I'm fortunate enough to have more time, sometimes a little time, but usually with all my guests, I get a couple minutes to talk about what the interview is going to be about. And I told David right before we started recording that there were some similarities between us, and some of them I highlighted in the book because it's interesting, but it's also, hey, I was going through the same thing at the time. And the first one starts right off at the beginning of the book. You open the book talking about how it came into the norm and how you observed others experiencing the onset of COVID. And you open about being at CPAC. Well, I was also at CPAC, right? So, but the funny thing about it for me, so I told you I was in New York, but what I didn't tell you, because I wanted your reaction here. So my wife and I lived in Chicago for years. I'm not from there. She's a native New Yorker, and she'd been there for over 20 years. And she decided to come back to New York, got a job offer. So we moved February of 20, right? I'm so confused with the years. We moved in February, right before all of the madness hit. So right at the beginning of February, we're here a couple of weeks, still living out of boxes. I went to CPAC and not knowing what was going to happen. And you talk about in the book how you all were talking about it a little bit in your writings, in your rooms and your meetings, a little bit, but not that much. Well, I wasn't paying attention to it at all. I was like normal American. I heard about it, not paying attention to it. The first time I really knew that this was a big deal was at CPAC. I'm sitting in a room because, you take breaks from all the breakout rooms. And I'm watching the news, and Trump was supposed to speak. It was the Saturday. And he was late for his speech because he stopped to do a press conference. And I keep forgetting what the original I think it was some prisoners that got released. And then right at the end, they said, by the way, excuse me, Mr. President, the first American died of COVID. What do you have to say? And that's when people started saying, what is this thing? Somebody died of this thing? What is this thing? It was only this was before there was even the cluster in New York. So as you describe in your book, the way this kind of opened up, I'm thinking back to the first time I thought about it and heard about it and started to, kick it around in my head. And it was the same time. And it's funny because we were in the same place at the time.
That is funny. And then, of course, the email came, a week later. Oh, by the way, there was a case at CPAC, right?
Right. So I got that email.
That's right. I'm really glad to hear you say that, because part of the reason that I did put in a lot of sort of my own personal experiences was, one of my favorite writers is James Joyce, and Joyce, among other people, said, in the particular, you find the universal. And I think particularly in this case and with the story of COVID, we were all going through such similar things that it really was my hope that if I wrote about, hey, this is the first time my behavior was changed because of COVID, or this is what Easter was like, not being able to go to church and not being able to see family, all of these things that we all went through, it really was my goal that people would, as you did, think back to their own experience and start to piece the crime scene back together a little bit, I guess is one way to put it.
I got to say, I really did put myself in the timeline as I was reading the book. And in several places, David and I were in the same place, experiencing the same thing at the same time. So that definitely made it interesting for me. Coming up, more with David Marcus, writer and author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed a Nation. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with David Marcus, author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed a Nation. And in this segment, we talk about when and why the COVID coverage and the COVID reaction became political. And what I think is the most important chapter in his book, the myth that we were all in this together. Everything tends to become political at some point, even when it shouldn't. And unfortunately, there's no difference here. But when and how did this become political?
Almost immediately, one of the worst aspects of this is that it happened in a presidential election year, and such a hyper polarized presidential election year. So, that was already going to be a recipe for disaster from a news media that basically operated for 4 years as if Trump says it has to be a horrible lie or, whatever. One of the first things that raised my eyebrow, and I believe this was on March 10th, so really early, really before the lockdowns, was when the Asian and Pacific Islander caucus in the House of Representatives condemned Trump for using the term Chinese virus. And I just said to myself, "Oh boy, here we go." Right? This is really what we're worried about when we say, Spanish flu and German. Like, is this what we're going to do? And sure enough, it's exactly what we did. But if I could just say, I do think there's a flip side of this, which is that in some senses it wasn't political enough, right? Because when you say, "Oh, this shouldn't be about politics, this should be about the science," that's kind of the trap that we fell in. Just deferring completely to the virus experts, because they don't know anything about unemployment. They don't know anything about the restaurant industry. They don't know anything about educating our kids, right? Mm-hmm. So because all of those things were being impacted by our choices, those were inherently political choices that should have been made by the body politic, and unfortunately were made by autocrats like Andrew Cuomo.
Well, that's a good point you made about it should have been political, because that's true. Early on, people started to say, when Fauci came to fame, they started to say stuff like, "Hey, I respect this guy as a scientist. I respect what he was saying. But should he be the guy we ask about economic issues, about logistic issues and things of that nature?" And even he said that early on. He's like, "Well, I'm just talking about the science. I'm not the guy that you come to for this." But then it became all encompassing. Fauci is the guy, whatever he says goes. So that's an interesting point to hear you say maybe should have been more political. I guess I don't know when the first time I noticed that it was becoming political, but I guess where me and the others who say it was bad that it became political. Okay, I'll spin it this way. So I said I just recently moved into New York. So what I would notice is I would watch the news, and I would notice how they would say, well, it became so from the how we approach it part, you're right. But what I was bothered by the politicizing of it, where it became all conservatives think this and all liberals think this. Like you hear today, people saying, "I don't want to take my mask off. I'm vaccinated, but I don't want people to think I might be a conservative." But early on, it was funny because you were in New York, so I'm sure you remember some of this. So I'm watching the news and watching the funniest thing for me was I was new, so I started to watch the local news to kind of understand New York. So watching the local news and then watching the national news was absolutely hilarious. So the national news was, this is spreading because of Trump's bad leadership and not taking it serious, and his followers, these ignorant conservatives who won't put on a mask and won't stay safe. Okay, that was the narrative across the board. But then I watched the local news, and for those of you who aren't in New York who didn't get this, what would happen would be we would see news stories of parties in the neighborhood, the whole block closed off, 500 people in the block not wearing masks having a party. Everybody was Black and Hispanic. They had to close the beach and send police to Brooklyn because people wouldn't stop going out and they wouldn't follow the social distancing guidelines. All of them were Black. I do my show remotely, but at the time, for the first 3 months, I went to the New York studios to do it. And it was light because it was a Sunday show. But occasionally I get on the subway and the only people not wearing masks were young black men. Right. So the narrative was these conservative MAGA country people are spreading the disease. But every time I saw people and every time I watched the news, the Halloween parties that they were going around to break up these raves that were maskless parties were all young people, mostly, hipsters who were white or black people. And lastly, we saw the police when they were trying to enforce social distancing, when they tackled the mother in the subway, or when the cop who got fired for slamming the black guy, they were all minorities. So unless we think that 90% of the people who voted for Trump were black, this didn't really fit into the national narrative that was being told, right?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. No, there was a narrative, not just from the beginning of COVID, but really from the beginning of the Trump presidency, where a lot of formerly somewhat serious news outlets like CNN, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, were really blatant about the fact that their number one priority was to get Donald Trump out of office. Mm-hmm. And that essentially that was such an important and good thing to do, that anything you did to advance that goal was sort of like wiped clean of any sins, even if that included, abandoning all of your journalistic standards, right? I mean, it didn't matter. If it was in the service of getting rid of Donald Trump, okay, right, we'll accept that. And they're still doing that, right? I mean, to this day, you get Gorsuch or you get Biden standing up there saying, the greatest threat that the country faces is white supremacist terrorism. I mean, look, I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm sure that it is on some level, but nobody's waking up in the morning, sitting over their cup of coffee and saying to themselves, geez, I hope I don't get blown up by a white supremacist today. I mean, it's fantasy land.
Right. It is absolutely insane. And, I just want to say, just to correct, obviously it's a slip of the tongue, but to be clear, you said Gorsuch, you meant Merrick Garland.
I meant Garland. Yes. Sorry. Yes. They will be forever links in my mind.
Right. But another thing you write about in the book, and I didn't even need to go into that topic because it's so obvious, but since we're talking about the dichotomy between the two, we got to mention the fact that it was so dangerous. We shut everything down because COVID was going to kill you. It was airborne and we were all going to die. But BLM rallies, social justice trumps all that. But what's the point of social justice if we're all dead because of COVID? But they let people go to the rally. You wrote a chapter about that, but we just got to put that out there, that in the sense that they're saying that we need to do everything we can to be safe. And Trump supporters are bad and maskers and they won't social distance, but rallies are good.
Yeah, I mean, it's madness. Those rallies, right? Remember, a month earlier, there had been protests in places like Michigan saying, we want some of our rights back. And those people were murderers.
Yes, exactly. So that's the part where politics is bad. Obviously, politicians had to make the decisions. So them, being more inclined to do with the will of the people, good. But that stuff was bad. Yeah. But now I want to move on to one of the most interesting chapters is the myth that we're all in this together. And I love this because you both lived both experiences, because you tend to forget things, which made me laugh. But also that I was saying these things all along. Even before you got into that chapter, you were talking about how your life started to change. Now I'm in an apartment and this going on. And one of the things you just kind of tossed out there as an aside that stuck with me was, the immigrant run neighborhood dry cleaner that been there for a while went out of business. But that's okay. Coming soon, Popeye sign was in the window, because you need to understand that there were winners and losers. Some people did better during this lockdown than others. So we weren't actually all in this together, right?
Oh, I mean, we weren't. I mean, on at least in sort of career and economic terms, I was one of those people. And I was acutely aware of that, both as I was covering the story and as I was writing the book, because, I was able to do my job as a columnist from my apartment. I wrote more columns than I ever had, I was able to go on TV and do that stuff. And yet when I walked to the grocery store here in southern Brooklyn, where I live, very residential, very nice neighborhood, there were lines around the block of, middle-class families, just, my neighbors lined up to get boxes of food from the city. We were giving away 1 million boxes of food a day. Mm-hmm. And the more I saw that and the more that I knew that that's not a reality that I was sharing with them. And maybe, and importantly, that's not a reality that most of the people who make the news, most of the people who produce the content, they weren't living that reality. And so, yeah, I paid a lot of attention to that. At one point, I went to Las Vegas, and I talk about that trip in the book, in part because I wanted to see what, in a hospitality town, right? In a town where so many people are affected, is the attitude different? And of course it was.
Coming up, more with David Marcus, author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed the Nation. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with David Marcus, author of Charade, and we're continuing our discussion on his myth, We're All in This Together. And I tell him about not only the difference between the haves and the have-nots, but even how we reacted to it. My family's in Northwest Indiana, right across the border from Chicago. Chicago was in New York shutdown. My brother was like, nothing's going on. So we talk about that, the difference between a big box store and a neighborhood store, and the hypocrisy of pushing a national COVID response.
I think that's right. It's funny that you mentioned Indiana, because just a couple weeks into the lockdowns, I had written a piece for the Federalist arguing that we can't treat the rest of the country like New York City. And I got dragged over the coals. That was my first sort of grandma killer moment, right? Where how dare you even say this? You're not a scientist. But part of what spurred me to write that piece was I was on the email list for the Federalist. And I'm in New York, like you say, it was pretty intense there for, I'd say, a month. When I walk to the grocery store, I walk on an overpass over the BQE, and there were no cars on the BQE, which anyone from New York will know is like a miracle. But yeah, so I said, is this the biggest crisis that the United States has faced in the last 100 years? And one of my editors who lives in Northern Indiana emailed back and said, what crisis? Because her experience was so completely different. And that's why in writing the book, I knew I also had to get out of New York eventually. And I was able to do that and see how some of the other parts of the country were dealing with it. But yeah, I think people still don't quite have their heads wrapped around just how different conditions were, depending on if you were in New York or Austin or, in Florida, or even the places that locked down were different. I was in Chicago a little after Thanksgiving. And like you say, even their rules were like the elevator rule was different. You know what I mean? Like both cities were locked down, but there were these slight little, and exactly as you say, like why? Like, why can I go to this store and I can't go to this store? Mm-hmm. None of it made sense until eventually it started to make a kind of nefarious sense.
Right.
I mean, I think about 8-9 months in, when you started thinking about, boy, who benefits from all this? And it's like Netflix, Amazon, and Zoom all seem to be doing pretty well.
Yep, really well. Right. I want to say one last thing about that that's interesting. So there was this big push between the governors. You write a whole chapter about it, like certain governors were trying to kill everybody, right? Human sacrifice and all that madness. But there's another piece that's interesting that no one talks about. So it was Cuomo the good, winning his Emmy, and DeSantis the bad, trying to kill everybody, right? But quietly, there were other areas, municipalities, counties, and states that were like, well, we're going to take a hybrid approach and we're going to do kind of what Florida said, but we're not going to get out on the microphone and give ourselves a pat on the back. We're just going to do it. So the point was, and the important piece to keep in mind is that Trump technically did the right thing. I mean, from, taking a true constitutional approach. He got beat up from either side. But the truth was, whether you think it's right or wrong, we were going to allow the states to decide. At some point, they weren't going to be the same. You were going to have different elevator rules in Chicago than you have in New York. You could have different rules, but that was going to happen. And that's not necessarily a failure, right?
No, of course it's not. I mean, among the biggest successes that I think Trump had was taking that federal approach, because everyone was screaming, oh, we need a one size fits all national approach. Well, first of all, we know what that would have been. That would have looked like New York, or that would have looked like California. And we now know that the results would have been far worse. So thank goodness that didn't happen. We should have learned more from states like Florida, or as you point out, Indiana, right? We should have been paying more attention to that. But yeah, the other point about Trump's federal approach and all these calls to nationalize the responses, it was never clear to me that the president of the United States, or even the Congress for that matter, had the authority to do that. Like, upon what authority? Like, okay, if you want to argue that like a state legislature can hand over emergency power indefinitely to a governor, like, I think that's a bad idea, but I can see legally how it works. If you're trying to tell me that Congress or the president of the United States can make the laws in New York State about like indoor capacity, I don't understand how the Constitution allows for that.
But this is what I got people with, because they get into political arguments. But I say, I'm going to give you an argument. The president can do it. But it seems weird that when Trump wanted to open, and you all said, well, he doesn't have the authority to open. Yet 3 months ago, you said he was failing at his job because he didn't close. So if he had the authority to close the states, then he has the authority to open the states. If he doesn't have the authority to open the states, he didn't have the authority to close it. It's really simple.
Yeah, that's spot on. I mean, that's yes. You know, right. Both of those things have to be true, or neither of them are true. Right. And yeah, you know, it's interesting just to briefly touch back on the point that we were discussing about the politicization. Mm-hmm. Part of it is less politicization than polarization, and the idea that you have to be so locked into your side that even if that leads to you making arguments that make no sense, it's your side. And so, you know, there were all kinds of failures of imagination throughout this whole process, hopefully that we can learn from.
Coming up, more with David Marcus, author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed the Nation. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with David Marcus, author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed the Nation. And in this segment, I asked him to focus on two of the core myths he mentioned, masks and lockdown. And my point here is not getting into the science of masks and whether we should wear them or whether we should have locked down for a period. It's, should people be wearing masks, or sometimes two masks, by themselves alone in the forest? And once we started to know the science of it all, should we be in extended lockdown? The mask thing that interests me is when, where, and how many. So I was bothered from the start, outside of the first 2 or 3 days. The one thing we did know is that there wasn't some green mist of COVID floating around, and if you opened up your window, you just collapsed. We all knew that, right? However, I got yelled at by people and my friends in Chicago early on, like when New York was at the height. I'd never wore a mask outside by myself. But when we ended the mask mandate on May 19th, I would say 90% of the people were still wearing masks outside, riding the city bikes with masks on. So I don't understand that outside. I never understood double masking, right? And then the thing with the kids, I love what you wrote, because I did the exact same thing. You know, my son, I would be like, you got to take that mask up outside. You're wearing. So I got to the point that I was telling him, you only wear it because we're rule followers, XYZ. I don't want you defying the teachers in school, but it's not because you're going to die if you don't take it off. You're going to be sick.
Absolutely. The mask thing became an absolute fiasco in myriad ways. It's still not clear how the guidance changed and why the guidance changed. So the basic timeline here is, first you were being told, this is in March, don't go buy a mask because we're running out. We don't have enough for the hospital workers. You know, if you want to put like a bandana around your face, we all remember this, right? You can do that, but you really don't need to. On April 3rd, the CDC changed its guidance to say you should be wearing a mask indoors and outdoors if you're within 6 feet of other people. It never got more severe than that. But that's what they said on April 3rd. The World Health Organization wouldn't change that guidance until June. So it's not like there was some bombshell study that like suddenly made this really obvious that this is what we had to do. But apparently what happened is some like aerosol scientists kind of like jumped into the conversation and were like, well, we have some theories that say that the mask might actually X, Y, and Z, because Fauci had said, you know, the droplets are too small. And they were like, well, wait, some of our research suggests something different. And on the basis of that, all of this guidance changed. And then finally, once we get people vaccinated and it's like, I'm vaccinated, can I take my mask off? And they said, no. Right. You know, none of it. At the end of the day, as with so much of this, the government and the media, they weren't interested in telling us the truth. They were interested in telling us whatever they thought would lead us to what they perceived as good behavior. Right. That was the bottom line. Their job was not to inform us. Their job was to manipulate us into doing what they thought we should be doing.
And that leads us to the lockdowns. You jokingly talk about in the book, the 2 weeks. That's just 2 weeks to see. And then something happens. Well, 2 weeks. Well, we're going to open Georgia. Let's wait 2 weeks. And 2 weeks ended up being, 9 or 10 months. But it's kind of like my double masking thing. I drew a line. I ignored the lockdown, whatever, fine. Inconvenience people, you're trying to save people. But the extended lockdown, once we knew the facts, why were we continuing the lockdown?
It was madness. I mean, I think it was December. In fact, I know it was. It was a week and a half before Christmas when Andrew Cuomo put tens of thousands of restaurant workers out of work by closing down indoor dining again, in the very same week when he released his own tracing numbers that showed that restaurants were only responsible for 1.4% of the spread. It made absolutely no sense. And again, it had nothing to do with science. It had to do with sending the message that you are to do as you're told. That's the bottom line. And the scary thing is that so many Americans did. Now, more Americans didn't than ever made it into the news, right? That's again to your point of all these places in the country that never got talked about. I love these ads now, these national ads you see where it's like, this is the first time anyone's gone for a beer in a year and a half. And it's like, what? Like nobody's seen their mom for like a year and a half. And it's like, that's not what's been happening in most people's lives.
Look, forget about Indiana. Have they been to Crown Heights?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it is this fantasy world, but man, there were people who did it. I have neighbors. It's a lovely Chinese immigrant family who I'm friends with to the extent that the language barrier permits it. But I realized at a certain point, I think about 3 months in, I was walking. I was walking to the grocery store, and one of the boys who's about my son's age and is friends with my son said, Charlie's dad, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to the grocery store. And he said, but what about coronavirus? And I was like, well, you can go to the grocery store. And I realized they hadn't left in months, right? And there were all kinds of people who did this because it's like, that's what you were told to do. Right. But there were tons of Americans who didn't do it because that's not really in the nature. It's not really in the nature of the American spirit to sort of be that obedient to government. But
right. I remember right at the beginning. Now, granted, I was new to New York, so I just didn't know people that I could do this with. But I had friends that were like, oh, they closed the schools. So what are you going to do? It's like, I just called a bunch of parents and we just have our kids hang out every day. What do you mean? What am I doing?
Yeah.
So you think that was that rare? Now, was it, 80% of the people? No, but even if it's 10, that's 330 million people here. That can be a lot of people. Coming up, my final segment with David Marcus, author of Charade. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. We've reached the final segment with David Marcus, author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed the Nation. And in the final segment, I ask him, what have we learned? Good, bad, or indifferent? What do we learn that will make us more prepared in the future, or that helped us understand some things we needed to change? I want to leave you with this. I want you to tell me what we have learned. Give me something good and bad. But, you did the research. So tell me, what have we learned now that we're on the back end of this pandemic?
I think one of the bad things that we learned is just what a death grip big tech oligarchs have over our discourse today. It's something that we really need to grapple with, because their ability to simply shut down accurate information that people then weren't allowed to see was a huge contributing factor to so many people not questioning the government for so long. I think if we learned a good thing from it, it might be that the teachers' unions aren't as all-powerful as they think they are, and that there were a lot of parents, like you just said, who said, well, wait a minute, why can't 10 of our kids be in the room? And if you know about history, you do that. If you're good at math, then you do that. I mean, forget about the pandemic. I mean, if we're going to send them to school to learn how awful the United States is, then why not just, keep them at home and teach them something that's not as toxic, right? So I think that the teachers' unions overplayed their hand by keeping the schools closed, by some of this other stuff. I think, again, you're seeing with critical race theory and other issues, and you're seeing parents fight the teachers' unions and the public school bureaucracies in a way that I might be missing something. I'd be curious if you remember anything, but I don't remember anything like this in my lifetime.
Oh, no, I can't think of anything anywhere close to it. Because, the things that were worse, but they only affected regions or states or cities, but not everywhere. So, yeah, there's nothing really like this, which, to be fair, is probably what made it so hard for them to grapple with it. But I don't think they necessarily went in the right direction. I don't know what the good thing. I think there's going to be something good for it, but I'm not smart enough to see what it is yet.
There's, there'll be a couple. I think in Pennsylvania right now, they're working on a constitutional amendment to make sure that the governor can never have this kind of extended emergency power that he's allowed to extend himself, like Cuomo's been doing. So I think if you see state legislatures realize that the emergency powers were abused and try to tighten them up, as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to give a governor autocratic, basically dictatorial power, that should be re-upped by the legislature on, if not a weekly, at least a bi-weekly basis. I don't see any justification for allowing that to go on any longer than that. So hopefully people start to wake up to that, because that's probably the most underreported story of the entire pandemic, is that most Americans were basically ruled by governors who answered to nobody.
Yeah, so maybe that's the thing. I hope that's the case, and you're absolutely right. But maybe one of the good things will be that people will say something. People will be more engaged. People will start to draw the line like we did. Maybe that will be the next step that will, maybe if nothing else, make that state legislature thing happen a little faster. But he is David Marcus, writer and author of Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed the Nation. It has been great speaking with you, and I hope we can do it again. We're in New York. We have to get together or something.
Absolutely. That was awesome, man. Thank you for having me.